Throughout the course of history, there's been many viciously cruel dictators, but few as deranged as Muammar Gaddafi.
This mad dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world revolution. He's a madman. I mean, he's just wacko.
Yet for over 40 years, the Libyan ruler terrifies, tortures, and torments the world with one horrific act after another.
He was evil to the core, psychotic, to the point that the U.S. government considered him the most dangerous man in the world.
This is the story of the Middle East's longest-serving dictator. From his roots as an idealistic young revolutionary to his insane actions at home and abroad, and how his delusions of grandeur ultimately lead to his downfall. October 2011. A wave of revolutionary uprisings is sweeping across the Middle East in what is being called the Arab Spring. In Libya, the 69-year-old dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, is running for his life. 2 months earlier, NATO-backed rebels forced him to flee his capital city, Tripoli.
Gaddafi heads to Sirte because it's where he hails from, and he believes that he can be protected by clan and tribal loyalties.
And little by little, these rebels were winning. And they were winning with pickup trucks and handguns.
After taking Gaddafi's last stronghold, the rebels are closing in on their main target, the dictator himself.
There are French jets flying overhead. It's a very chaotic scene.
Suddenly, the colonel's convoy is hit by a NATO airstrike, forcing the once almighty tyrant to take refuge in a sewage pipe. But how has it come to this? In 1969, Libya is a country dripping with oil money. Over the past 10 years, it's gone from one of the world's poorest nations to one of the richest. But not everyone is enjoying the good times.
Most Libyans lived in the country in very impoverished conditions, basically hand-to-mouth.
Their ruler, pro-Western King Idris I, is deeply corrupt.
King Idris spent a lot of the oil revenue on him and his associates and his family, and not much on the Libyan people.
Struggling at the very bottom of Libyan society are the Bedouins.
Bedouins are illiterate nomadic tribes that move around just trying to survive.
One Bedouin, an army officer, is determined to end the misery of his fellow countrymen by freeing them from Western imperialist influences.
Gaddafi in 1969 was an officer at just 27 years old. He was a young, idealistic man who wanted to change Libya.
As early as high school, he is recruiting friends that he wants to bring into a revolutionary government sometime down the road.
So he planned from way back then, both he and his associates, to infiltrate the army and then use that as the venue to stage the coup.
After more than 10 years of planning, Gaddafi is ready to make his move. With King Idris out of the country receiving medical treatment in Turkey, the mission he calls Operation Jerusalem is a go. He makes his way to the Burqa barracks in Benghazi, Libya's second city.
In terms of coups, you'd have to give it an A. He moved in seamlessly. The generals and the officers just gave up and let him do it. Not a drop of blood was shed. No shot was fired. Probably one of the most peaceful coups that has ever happened in history.
Victorious, at 6 a.m., Muammar Gaddafi arrives at Benghazi Radio. For the first time, he speaks to the Libyan people.
As of now, Libya shall be free under the name of the Libyan Arab Republic. Free brothers in a society over which, God willing, shall flutter the banner of brotherhood and equality.
They broke out in the streets and were elated, celebrating that they had this new government, a man of the people. There was this elation that ran through Libya.
With his fellow accomplices, he proclaims a new revolutionary command council. Gaddafi is its chairman, making the 27-year-old the most powerful man in Libya. To the Libyan people, their new leader appears to be a force for good. He's progressive. He claims to want to modernize the nation through his socialist Al-Fatah revolution. Radical new policies call for the country's oil wealth to be used to help the poor.
He built roads, he built schools, he increased literacy, increased the lifespan of people.
Gaddafi built housing complexes, apartment complexes.
He made a big deal of telling people, these are your homes, this is your property.
The quality of life in Libya for a time was actually higher than that of states like Brazil and Soviet Russia.
It's all part of young Colonel Gaddafi's plan to be a great Arab leader. Just like his boyhood hero, the charismatic Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Gaddafi views Nasser as an ideological father figure.
Abdel Nasser to Gaddafi was his ultimate hero. Abdel Nasser was the first pan-Arabian revolutionary. And Gaddafi started listening to him on the radio when he was in secondary school. And Gaddafi immediately identified with Nasser, so much so that Nasser became his idol, literally. He memorized all of his speeches. He was known in school for going around getting up on stools and reciting Nasser's speeches verbatim. He was obsessed with the man.
He emphasized freedom, socialism, and unity. The very same themes that Nasser had identified early on in the Egyptian Revolution. And by freedom, he meant independence within Libya from foreign powers and foreign domination, as exemplified particularly by the base agreements with Great Britain and the United States. Outside of Libya, he meant freedom to associate with the Arab world in an Arab nationalist kind of way. Unity was also a dominant theme, and unity was in the sense of forming not just vocal or verbal agreements with Arab nations, but practical Arab unity, as Nasser had been proclaiming. The third theme that he developed was socialism. And by socialism, he meant taking the wealth of Libya and distributing it more equally amongst the people of Libya. And you can distinguish that from communism, which he did not support because he saw it as a godless system. And he was very much a Muslim, a very strong Muslim, and very much made Islam a part of his total revolution.
With his success in driving out Western influence in Egypt, far-reaching reforms, and modernization policies, Nasser is widely considered the leader of the Arab world. When Nasser suddenly dies of a heart attack in 1970, Gaddafi seizes the opportunity to move from disciple to master. His rallying cry is the Palestinian cause against Israel.
Gaddafi despised Israel way back from his very, very early beginnings. He considered Israel as a robber of Muslim lands.
To him, Israel is the great symbol of the tyranny of America and the West in the Middle East.
He viewed Israel as sort of a neo-colonial project that was being superimposed on the Arab world. It was something that injured Arab dignity, and it put a wedge in the heart of the Middle East.
Now he's leader of Libya. What he needs is to demonstrate to all other Arabs that he can be their leader too.
This is an ITN newsflash from the Olympic Village in Munich, where early this morning armed Palestinian guerrillas raided the sleeping quarters of the Israeli team. The gunmen shot dead 2 Israelis and are now holding 20 athletes and 6 officials as hostages.
In September 1972, the world is in shock by the appalling attack at the Munich Olympics by Palestinian group Black September. Less well known is that Black September is funded by Gaddafi.
Gaddafi considered it a perfectly acceptable operation based on his worldview, and despite the bloodthirsty, murderous things that these terrorists did, he considered them heroes.
The guerrillas have just announced that they are demanding to be allowed to fly out of Germany once their demands have been met.
In the final showdown, all the Israeli hostages are killed, along with 5 terrorists. Gaddafi has the terrorists' bodies flown to Libya.
When the dead Palestinians arrived in Libya, I guess the word would be bizarre. Carrying the dead terrorists off the plane, of course, Gaddafi had it televised for the whole world to see. Gruesome, morbid in a normal person's mind, but not in Gaddafi's mind.
When the surviving 3 terrorists are released, they too are taken to Libya. There, the Libyan leader treats them like rock stars.
He knew that this would be an international stage now, an international drama, and that he's the director, and producer of this whole thing.
That was Gaddafi saying to the whole world, look at me, look how powerful, look how big I am, look what I've done, Muammar Gaddafi, I am Libya.
Trouble is, not even the Arab world is listening. For Gaddafi, there's a realization. If he's going to be noticed, he must project his power beyond the region.
Gaddafi felt like he was much more than just a tiny little dictator of a country only 6 million people.
With such a small population, no amount of military hardware is going to help this revolutionary of international proportions achieve his goal. But he does have something very powerful: money, and lots of it. Leading Gaddafi to support and fund one of the most important freedom fighters of the day, Nelson Mandela.
Certain leaders in the West, particularly in the UK, viewed Nelson Mandela as at best a troublemaker and at worst a terrorist figure.
But not Gaddafi.
He was the African National Congress's not only primary supporter, but in many cases only supporter. He befriended Mandela as an underdog, supported him as an underdog against this great imperialist South Africa, became very close to them. The two were photographed together several times, and in Gaddafi's mind, he was helping this new underdog, saw himself in Mandela.
Nelson Mandela called Gaddafi the brother leader.
And in recognition of his vocal and financial support, one of Mandela's grandsons is called Gaddafi.
Gaddafi supported a bizarre array of insurgent, communist, and terrorist organizations. Absolutely bizarre. He looked at all these organizations purely as underdogs against big imperialist, tyrannical governments.
And Gaddafi becomes one of the world's greatest sponsors of international terrorism. It's claimed that every IRA bomb planted in the UK used a plastic explosive known as Semtex, provided by Libya.
He had links with the FARC in Colombia, Abu Sayyaf in the southern Philippines, the Abu Nidal group.
He supported the Black Panther movement, the ETA.
Red Army in Germany and affiliated organizations in Italy.
Terrorism for Gaddafi isn't just political. It develops into something highly personal.
He got a very perverse pleasure out of terrorism.
Gaddafi, having been a Bedouin, one of the foundations of his personality was the great underdog rising to power for the people.
He was a Just a very, very egotistical man. It was more ego than even ambition.
The colonel's sponsorship of terrorism kills thousands of innocent people, but it achieves his aims. It gets him noticed.
He was state terrorist enemy number one, to the point where the U.S. government and the intelligence agencies considered him the most dangerous man in the world.
6 years on from seizing power, the Libyan dictator's extensive support of various terrorist groups starts causing him trouble at home.
This was unpopular with many of the members of the Revolutionary Command Council. They thought that money should be going to economic development.
In response to his critics, in 1977, he disbands the Revolutionary Command Council and announces to his people that he has discovered a new political system, an alternative to capitalism and communism. He calls it his Third International Theory, and it's his revolutionary solution to the problems of the entire Third World. It's his bid to be taken seriously as a statesman-philosopher, a vision he spells out in his Green Book.
He thought the Green Book was a masterpiece. He thought everyone should be studying it, much like Hitler's Mein Kampf or Mao Zedong's book or our Constitution.
In fact, Gaddafi's supposedly visionary manifesto is a rambling mishmash of often contradictory statements.
Gaddafi's book was gibberish. One of the ideas was he wanted everyone to have chickens. And he made everybody in the country have chickens. And he gave them chickens and he gave them cages to put the chickens in, including people who lived in apartment houses. People ate the chickens and they used the cages to hold newspapers. And it was crazy.
Although it seems comic, the Green Book hides a much darker motive. It's his tool of indoctrination.
School children were forced to read it. It was something that was part of their everyday education. Reading that book and looking at photos of him.
Part of his ideology is that there is no need for political parties, government, or even laws. Instead, Libyans will have direct democracy through new basic people's congresses.
This concept of democracy was a complete farce, and that Libya was really a pure dictatorship, and it was all about Gaddafi.
Gaddafi announces he isn't president, or even prime minister, merely the brother leader and guide of the revolution. It's an ingenious move.
He didn't refer to himself as the head of state, so there was no way for him to be removed.
The brother leader concludes his cutting-edge political theories with a telling statement: those who are strong in society govern. In his case, his strength comes from his vast and vicious secret police network.
People never really knew for sure who it was that was spying on who. It was not uncommon to see people pulled off the street, hustled into an unmarked car, and driven away. You don't need to do that too often to too many people that everybody gets a little concerned about, if I've done something wrong, am I next?
And if Gaddafi decides you have crossed him, he will crush you. This is actual footage broadcast on Libyan state television in 1984. Hundreds of school children, some as young as 6 years old, are assembled at Benghazi Basketball Stadium. Judges appear and announce they are putting 30-year-old Sadek Shwedi on trial.
Sadek Shwedi was a young student who had been studying engineering in the United States. When he returned to Libya, Gaddafi accused him of being part of a plot in Tripoli to overthrow the regime in early 1984. This was a show trial in the grandest possible terms, a huge audience.
Sadek is forced to confess despite his innocence and is quickly pronounced guilty.
It's absolutely twisted how this takes place in front of a lot of school children.
But there's an unexpected turn in this harrowing event.
Sidek's neck doesn't immediately snap in the gallows.
A young woman in the crowd sees an opportunity.
She then comes and pulls Schweide's legs down in a very brutal fashion.
Millions watch as she kills Sidek and becomes known throughout Libya as Huda the Executioner. And Gaddafi sees to it that she is made one of the richest and most powerful women in the country. An example to all Libyans of the rewards for being loyal to the brother leader. But public executions at home aren't enough. He will pursue any Libyan who opposes him, wherever they may hide.
Gaddafi's intelligence services span the world. So Gaddafi could reach you in Cairo, in London, in Paris. Gaddafi had ways of finding dissenters.
He calls his exiled opponents stray dogs and savagely hunts them down in the streets of Europe.
He wanted these killings to be public. That was part of his MO. Unlike maybe what the Soviets would do, is they would poison somebody and whisk them away. In secret, Gaddafi wanted these killings in public areas and assassinate them, showing them how great he was and his tentacles outside of Libya.
Most notoriously in April 1984, when a group of dissidents peacefully protest outside the Libyan embassy in London, his agents open fire indiscriminately.
A policewoman in front of the demonstrators was hit in the stomach.
25-year-old police constable Yvonne Fletcher is fatally shot, murdered in broad daylight. As a way of making the world take notice of him, it succeeds. The UK severs diplomatic relations with Libya. Gaddafi doesn't care. He's already found an even bigger stage to play on.
Of all the modern dictators, Gaddafi needed attention the most.
He phases from periods of lucidity into complete instability. At this point, he's getting out of control.
In early 1986, the US Navy is on maneuvers in the Mediterranean Sea off the northern coast of Libya. They are heading straight towards an area of water known as the Gulf of Sidra.
The U.S. was doing typical naval training operations in the Gulf as they had before, and they got a threat from Gaddafi himself. You will not conduct operations in my Gulf. Of course, the United States was, wait a minute, that's not your Gulf. Those are international waters. And Gaddafi said, no, the Gulf is mine. You cross the line of death, and you'll pay the price.
Libya fires 6 missiles at US planes. America retaliates by sinking 3 Libyan patrol boats and destroying a missile installation. Gaddafi now ups the ante, declaring it's a time of war. And he will fight his war dirty. Actions that put him on a collision course with the US, making him their public enemy #1. US intelligence agents in West Berlin intercept a strange telex from the Libyan East German embassy. Tripoli will be happy when you see the headlines tomorrow. Just hours later, a woman walks into a West Berlin nightclub.
The LaBelle nightclub was known as the American place. It's where the soldiers used to hang out and their families. And if you wanted to hurt Americans in Germany, that was the place to do it.
And tonight is no different, with the dance floor packed with American soldiers. At 1:45 a.m., a 2-kilogram bomb packed with plastic explosives and shrapnel explodes. 3 people, including 2 American servicemen, are killed. Another 229 are wounded, many suffering life-changing injuries.
It was a horrific scene, and it shocked the United States, of course. It was one of the first direct attacks where U.S. servicemen had been killed in an explosion like that. So it created not just shock, but outrage.
Later, in Berlin, U.S. intelligence intercepts another message destined for Libya. At 1:30 this morning, a successful operation was carried out without leaving any trace of our identity.
And it was already pretty clear who had done it, and then intercepts after that pretty much confirmed, as the agents were bragging back and forth, that indeed it was Libya.
Washington is in no doubt. Gaddafi is U.S. public enemy number 1.
This mad dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world revolution.
10 days later, President Reagan orders Operation El Dorado Canyon. Gaddafi's Bab al-Azia compound is hit. But despite his home being flattened, he escapes unharmed. Though he claims not all his family are so lucky.
Gaddafi came out with a bleeding heart statement that they'd killed Hannah, his adopted daughter.
He sought to use that as a means to depict himself as someone who was under fire from the great Satan, from the United States, and use that as a means to build popular support for himself and his regime.
And rails against the West.
Your government is a terrorist government. Reagan is the biggest terrorist in the world. You are far from the civilization. We are a nation of civilization.
Yet not all is as it seems.
It turned out to be an absolute hoax. His daughter was not killed at all.
But the truth is not going to stop Gaddafi having his revenge on the U.S.
In the immediate aftermath, you could almost see that he was mentally deranged by the attack.
He was relatively unstable, but he was crazy like a fox. You couldn't do that to Muammar Gaddafi, the great one, the brother leader. Anybody that did that, well, they had to be put back in their place.
Among the 259 passengers and crew boarding Pan Am Flight 103 at London's Heathrow Airport is 36-year-old Michael Bernstein.
We were college sweethearts. We were very, very happy. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was a terrific father, loved his children very much.
At 6:25 p.m., the plane takes off for New York. By 7:03 p.m., Pan Am Flight 103 is 31,000 feet over Lockerbie, Scotland.
A device had blown about a 20-inch hole in the cargo hold.
The plane was ripped apart at 35,000 feet.
What occurred was a massive fireball coming out of the sky, 200,000 pounds of ignited jet fuel. That's like a giant bomb going off, and registered as if it was an earthquake. That was the magnitude.
It wiped out a dozen or more homes. Some people in those houses were obliterated. They never found any remains of anybody.
270 people are killed in the Lockerbie disaster, including Stephanie's husband, Michael.
It wasn't until I was in the basement on the exercise bike watching the news that I saw a news story about this plane that had gone down in Scotland. But I had the proverbial sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, knowing that it could have been his plane. My son came downstairs first, and he had just turned 4. So 4-year-olds don't really have the concept of death being irreversible. And then when my daughter came downstairs, she looked like she had been punched in the stomach because, of course, at age 7.5, she did understand what it meant. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life.
At the time, the Lockerbie bombing is the worst act of terror ever committed against Americans. Back in Libya, Gaddafi denies any links to the bombing.
At that point, most people thought it was Iran. We didn't think it was Libya until later on. The fear was that they would never know who did it. First of all, if the plane had been on time, would have crashed in the ocean, we never would have found the timer or anything. But it landed in Scotland. We were able to get the remains and help people and eventually find evidence. But no one knew who did it, and we couldn't get any answers. We couldn't get any answers because there weren't any answers. I mean, no one knew. There were 19 separate countries who were involved in this investigation because there were 19 separate nationalities on the plane. At that time, it was the largest investigation in the history of our FBI.
They found a little electronic switch circuit board that was embedded in some of the metal as part of the evidence. They began to trace this and piece it back together. They traced the circuit board to the same triggering device that a Libyan agent had used earlier to try to detonate a Semtex bomb in a failed terrorist attack. Same type of circuit board. They also traced it to a shipment of the same circuit boards that were sold, a large number of them were sold to the Libyan military. So they were pretty certain that that circuit board came from Libya.
But despite those denials, an almost 4-year investigation reveals 2 Libyan agents planted the bomb on board the plane.
It would change the game for the CIA in the United States. We had an enemy on our hands now that could do this sort of thing, that could carry out this kind of sophisticated plot undetected.
In response, the United Nations imposes tough sanctions.
Gaddafi became something of an international pariah. That did not suit well with him because he had always envisioned Libya as too small a playhouse. So it was a very difficult pill for him to swallow.
The Libyan dictator's response to this isolation is to sink even further into cruelty and lust for revenge. His methods will become ever more deranged. One example can be seen in his treatment of his one-time foreign minister. Mansour Rashid al-Kikia defected in 1980. For 13 years, Gaddafi bides his time. In December 1993, al-Kikia arrives in Cairo, Egypt, for a meeting of the Arab Human Rights Organization he helped establish.
To have one of your own who you have trusted turn against you and make strong public statements and organize against you abroad. That was beyond the pale in Gaddafi's mind, and he felt he had to deal with al-Kikia.
Gaddafi's agents are waiting for him.
Everyone assumed that he had been detained by Libyan authorities. Obviously, the family continued to hope that he was somehow alive.
In fact, only one person ever sees him again. That person is Muammar Gaddafi, and he keeps him in his freezer.
An evil, evil man. The fact that you could enjoy personally killing people, having their heads frozen in refrigerators so you come look at them all the time, There's an evil there that is hard to contemplate.
Isolated and marginalized from world affairs, the man who wants the entire planet to know his name and fear him sinks deeper into madness, making himself feel better by inventing ever more ludicrous titles. Imam of all Muslims, Dean of Arab rulers, King of Africa's kings. His attention-craving megalomania even starts to affect the way he looks.
Gaddafi's outfits became more lavish and more flamboyant, to where he sort of became the Liberace of the Arab world. His look became more absurd.
He looked like one of those characters in a Gilbert and Sullivan musical, one of those crazy admirals, full of gold, brocade, and medals and whatnot. He went from the fancy admiral's clothes to Bedouin stuff. A couple of times he wore something that looked like a brown garbage bag.
He changed his wardrobes several times a day. When asked about it, he would respond, well, I set the fashion trends for my country. What I wear becomes a fad amongst the people. And he deluded himself into thinking that his garish, flamboyant dress was what the people wanted.
The Arabs were starting to get a little bit embarrassed about it. They got tired of him, and he decided, okay, well, I'm not an Arab anyway, I'm an African.
One of the unique features of Gaddafi was he had histrionic tendencies. This is called a histrionic personality disorder. These people love drama. It's how pretty they look and how much attention they can gather. And that was him to an extreme. Gaddafi kind of arranged so that he was always playing a role, that people were always talking about him.
His extreme makeover isn't just confined to his wardrobe.
Gaddafi wanted plastic surgery because he was a very vain man. His image was the image of Libya. Billboards of him were all over the country, all over Libyan cities. Gaddafi wanted to remain youthful, and he wanted to maintain his looks.
Over the years, the Libyan dictator reportedly went under the knife several times.
In his view, he was a good-looking guy.
For this superpower wannabe, grandiose titles and fresh-faced beauty isn't enough. Nero had his Praetorian Guard. Hitler had the SS. Gaddafi will trump them all. He will be the first in history to have a guard made up entirely of women. In classic Gaddafi style, he establishes some bizarre entry requirements for his Amazonian bodyguards.
To be an Amazonian bodyguard, you have to be tall, you have to have long hair, you have to be beautiful, and you have to be the girl you would notice immediately. He would notice immediately. That's very important.
Soon he travels everywhere with his phalanx of Amazonian guards, to the international media's delight.
He knew absolutely, perfectly that that would attract the attention. Publicly, Gaddafi is a big defender of women. He's a guy who really fights for their freedom. He wants to liberate the Arabic woman.
But the private reality couldn't be further from the truth.
When you become one of the Amazonian women around him, you were part of his harem. They are kept just like in prison, and he was calling the girls night and day, beating them, obliging them to have sex with 1, 2, 3, 4 people, and obliging them to smoke, to drink, to dance, to take cocaine. It was just like a beast, like an animal.
And it isn't just the Amazonians who are Gaddafi's prey.
He was obsessed by sex. very often have been said that he needed to have 4 different girls per day.
Gaddafi uses his position as the brotherly leader to seek out more and more victims, including his official visits to schools.
Schools, of course, was a wonderful reservoir for him. He put his hand on her head. That was a signal for his bodyguard to say, this one, I want her. And she could say bye-bye to her childhood.
He would go to weddings and pick out girls that he wanted to have kidnapped and raped. In some cases, they'd be killed and then never found again.
The women and girls taken by Gaddafi are utterly helpless.
Sex and rape are totally taboo. You can't talk about that in Libya. It's a very, very conservative society. Rape means that your life is totally destroyed, that you're going to be ostracized if it's known, that you are going to be pushed out of your family. It's a perfect crime. The criminal and Gaddafi himself could do anything he wanted because he knew that nobody would talk.
Rape isn't just Gaddafi satisfying his own base desires. He uses it to terrorize his opponents.
He used sex to dominate people, to humiliate people. It was a tool for him to govern. And when he wanted to humiliate someone, mostly rich and powerful people in his country, he used to rape the daughters of their wives. It's impossible to know how many women and girls Gaddafi raped. I think it's possible to say that Gaddafi is the most prolific rapist in history.
Absurd-looking, sex-crazed, a rapist, Gaddafi's reign of madness continues to inflict endless misery on his people, made worse by crippling international sanctions. Then an event comes along that gives him a chance to relaunch himself. To most people, 9/11 is a monstrosity. To Gaddafi, it's an opportunity.
It was really a surprise. Gaddafi came out and condemned 9/11, publicly gave his support and sympathy for the victims of 9/11, condemned Osama bin Laden, actually put a warrant out for Osama bin Laden's arrest.
In a publicity stunt, Gaddafi offers to donate blood to the victims of 9/11.
The brother leader has no great love for Islamic fundamentalism, seeing it as a possible threat to himself. It makes it easy for the man who was once the world's greatest terrorist to join the war on terror.
He began providing legitimate intelligence to the CIA and to Washington on movements of al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and legitimate intelligence became essentially an intelligence partner to the United States against al-Qaeda.
He even complies with Western demands.
He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. He obviously took that to the bank and said, I don't want this to happen.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had set out to lead the world against the West, does a complete 180 to save his own skin. And it seems to work. On March the 24th, 2004, despite the murder of Yvonne Fletcher, sponsoring the IRA and the Lockerbie bombing, the former mad dog of the Middle East is welcomed back from the cold by British Prime Minister Tony Blair. With his newfound friends in the West, Gaddafi is sure his reign will never end. A mistake that ultimately proves fatal. By September 2009, after 4 decades of trying, it seems Muammar Gaddafi's dreams of being an international statesman are coming true. Despite the years of systematic murder, torture, and rape, To maintain his tyrannical regime, the Libyan dictator is feted by world leaders.
He was such a con man that he thought he had everybody fooled. He thought that we all would now support him in anything that he wanted to do, that from here on out it was going to be a love affair. That was never going to be a love affair. We wouldn't trust him as far as we could throw him.
But then in early 2011, a wave of revolutionary uprisings start to spread through the Arab world. The Arab Spring. In February, peaceful protests start in Libya.
His response was, no, 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 the Libyan people love me. They all love me. This is Al-Qaeda. They've drugged the people, and as he said, as soon as the people come off the drugs that Al-Qaeda has drugged them with, they'll come back and they'll realize that they love me. And the United States has put hallucinogens in their Nescafe. He had gone into full-blown delusion at that point.
The brother leader starts indiscriminately turning his heavy weapons on his own people.
Gaddafi was bragging, I'm going to crush them. He called them all rats. He said it's going to be a river of blood. He gave these more and more crazy speeches when he really should have just shut up.
Gaddafi assumes that his newfound friends in the West will ignore his increasingly brutal response. Appalled, NATO comes out in support of the Libyan opposition. They enforce a no-fly zone and provide airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces.
Gaddafi was irate and made a number of threats. I think most importantly that when this thing was over, he would make sure that people in Europe paid for the NATO intervention.
It's an empty threat, a final sign of how deluded he has become. By October 2011, the 69-year-old Libyan dictator is desperately fleeing from city to city as the Western-backed rebels take over.
Gaddafi was going down with the ship. He had no intention of abandoning Libya. He had no intention of relinquishing power. When the rebels take Tripoli, Gaddafi goes on the run, and he eventually finds himself in Sirte, which is his hometown.
Within weeks, Gaddafi is forced to flee even there. Crawling through the desert sands, he desperately searches for an undamaged vehicle to continue his escape. With no luck. A few minutes later, reality finally catches up with him.
He was yelling at these people, saying, how can you do this? I'm your leader. The people love me. And one of these guys slapped him in the face and said, shut up, you dog.
Years of oppression and hatred come flooding out. After 42 years, Gaddafi's reign of terror is over.
I think half the country marched by to see him dead on that dirty mattress. We didn't make sure he was dead. They just wanted to see it, that it was over.
At last, Libya is free. A moment one of his victims, Stephanie Bernstein, remembers well.
I remember very clearly the day that Gaddafi was killed, and I was on the phone with my daughter. And I said, and we began to cry, he can't hurt anybody anymore.
Sadly, the 2011 revolution has quickly dissolved into bitter civil war. Muammar Gaddafi left Libya so divided, the country is still struggling to emerge from the shadow of his evil.